language, transportation, medicine, science, democracy, arts, and more. Pollen is committed to shaping a narrative and sharing stories that help us imagine a different future and examine the steps towards that future. Stories that share a spectrum of voices, stories that move away from false and harmful narratives about Native Americans and towards new and contemporary narratives that repair, harm, and center strength, pride, and resiliency. We will bolster our ongoing efforts to hire and support the work of Native storytellers, artists, and performers. And we will engage with and amplify the work of local Native-led organizations and actions that benefit Native communities. Here's what you can do. Lift up Native truths and interrupt false narratives. Learn about the Native peoples and tribes who are a part of the community. Support Native-owned businesses like those along the American Indian Corridor. Hire Native artists. Demand accurate Indigenous history in Minnesota schools. Pollen would like to acknowledge and thank the Native Governance Center and Reclaiming Native Truth for their guidance and resources. Some more housekeeping notes before we move on to the exciting parts of the event. Please help share today's wisdom with your social networks with the hashtag #ChangeTheStoryMSP. Today wouldn't be possible without the support of our sponsors, who we truly see as partners. Please help us thank them and give them shout outs on social media. Thank you to our presenting sponsors, the Bush Foundation and US Bank, our supporting sponsor, Software for Good, and our community sponsors, Hiring Revolution, a new book by Alfonso Winker, Trina Olson of Team Dynamics, Clockwork, and iBailey. Lastly, before we continue with our performance and panel discussion for this morning, I want to take a minute to wish one of our Pollen team members a happy birthday, Tom Loftus, who's pulling all the strings behind the scenes. I want to take a moment from all of us here at Pollen to wish you a happy birthday, Tom, and invite everybody else to please feel free to share your birthday love and wishes with Tom in the chat during our event. Now let's kick off today's program with a poetry reading by Chavah Gabrielle. Chavah Gabrielle is a literary and performance artist, the second St. Paul Youth Poet Laureate, author of Bodies I Am Willing to Worship, a modern aromantic romantic poet. As an organizer, they are striving to create spaces of equity and kindness. Chavah seeks sustainability, challenging the idea that we can only create growth and change in one way. With a focus on community wellness, care, reproductive justice, and liberation, Chavah strives to live by Carol Hanish's words, "The personal is political." Chavah carves out spaces where everyone, but especially women and femme persons of color, can enter with their full selves. Welcome, Chavah.
Thank you for that beautiful intro. Yeah, I'm just gonna jump into the poem. It's really great to be here, so thank you. And if you asked me what heaven looked like, or probably not this lifetime, but also maybe this lifetime, or a table in the face of my enemies, or an ode to all my dead. Psalms 23, 2-4. They make me lie down in green pastures. They lead me beside still waters. They restore my soul. They lead me to paths of righteousness for their name's sake. Though I walk through the shadow of the valley of death, I shall fear no evil. And as a child, I did not know the name of the verse, but the words always stuck to the roof of my mouth like peanut butter in fear. And as a child, I did not know phrases such as anti-capitalists, autonomy, and accessibility politics. I did know battery, bloody limbs, and the deep desire to escape. And that there is a truth, even before I knew the words to know, which is, I cannot be free if I only free myself. And as a child, I would stare at the stars. All my heroes are dead and must live there. And someone said heaven to me once in a dream. And the desert became foliage. And Tubman came to me. She said, eat, child. The first step to knowledge is fear, and the valley is approaching. And I feel I am preparing for a great loss, as though something in me may be dying. And after I lose everything, I feel we will win. And Tubman's last words were, I go prepare a place for you. And I believe this. In the dream, Tubman takes my hand. In real life, it was a seizure. In both, I see green pastures, children laughing. I would say heaven has clean drinking water, and no one gets lost. And you can chase the rivers and waterfalls, and the fires only hold you. I would say heaven tastes like warm honey. I would say heaven smells like sage and juniper and citrus and black African soap. Here in heaven, all that is dead and all that is not dead meet. Thank you.
Thank you, Chavah. Thank you for sharing. And thank you for readying our hearts and minds for today's conversation with that moving piece of poetry and that beautiful performance. This morning, we're honored to be in conversation with St. Paul City Council member Mitra Jalali, McKnight Foundation's Director of Learning, Neeraj Mehta, and poet Chavah Gabrielle. Our moderator for today is my colleague Jerome Rankin, Pollen's editorial director. Please welcome our panel and Jerome with a warm round of virtual applause.
Thanks, everybody. I'm Jerome Rankin, Pollen's editorial director, and I'm excited to have a tremendous group of folks to help us dig through some big ideas. So the concept of imagining something better is one step toward change, but it's not the only step. Most often, an idea that's dreamed up by community has to supplant an old idea, and we know that old ideas can be pretty stubborn. We're going to examine that dynamic today and talk through some of the tools and techniques to be used to usher in change through narrative shifts. We've got with us, as Ruby let us know, Mitra Jalali. She's the proud daughter of immigrants, a former classroom teacher, community organizer, and policy aide, who now represents Ward 4 on the St. Paul City Council. So welcome to Mitra. We've also got Neeraj Mehta, Director of Learning at the McKnight Foundation, who spent his career working at the intersections of urban planning and community development, community organizing, and research justice. Welcome to Neeraj. We've already met and heard wonderfully from Chavah this morning, and I'm excited to welcome them to this conversation as well. So this is our crew. I'm excited to jump in. So to get started in this conversation, I want to dig into first the overarching idea of narratives, and then we're going to dig into some specifics. So this first question, all the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and each other can be false, they can be actively harmful. So then I think the question is, why do they exist? Why do they persist? And who do they serve? So this question is for any and all of you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the origins and the purposes behind these harmful narratives.
I can go. Is that cool? I'll just start. Jerome.
That's cool.
Okay. Thank you for on the equivalent of a Monday morning, just being like, talk about your imposter syndrome to get us started. I am reading, first of all, hi everyone. Thank you, Pollen. Thank you, fellow panelists. Thank you everyone for who's here. So I'm reading Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong right now. And the book is described as an Asian American reckoning. And I am halfway through it already. And it's all I will talk about. And I keep bringing it up because it's just ripping me up. But it talks a lot about what is the story that Asian Americans who are non-Black Asian Americans, non-other ethnic group Asian Americans, what do we believe and why do we believe it? And it not only talks about things that I think a lot of folks in this have some awareness of now, which is like model minority myth and sort of the way that we are set up in the American race conversation and like who that benefits. But like on a personal level, it's like a Korean woman wrote it, and she talks about like feeling sick all the time with herself in her mind, like never actually able to take up space in the way that feels like empowering to her. And she talks a lot about shame and just being socialized into like shamefulness about herself. And so I guess like it is worth considering that self-hatred is like taught for people of color, and that we were not made that way, and that there are economic interests benefiting and like social interests benefiting from us thinking that and feeling that. And so I will just leave it at that because I want to hear what others think. But the question hits a certain way for me this morning, because I think like more broadly, and what I'll talk about in the follow-up questions is like, I am serving our community right now as an elected official, but I never stopped being Mitra Jalali. And this is an experience where you can sort of lose yourself. You can sort of like have a life as a public figure and lose your life as a private person. And I think this book is helping me kind of reconnect all of those Mitras into like one person, where I can just like not have to hide that and participate in more self-hatred by like hiding that in the way that I lead. So that's just an opening thought, but I'm really eager what others have to share too.
I can jump in following that, and I don't totally remember the question, so I'm just going to go with what's in my head, which is like narrative is where the power is. So I'm a big fan of Stephen Luke's, Donella Meadows, and what we know is when you control the mic, when you control the narrative, you control the agenda. When you control the agenda, you control what decisions get made. And I think sometimes, and all three of those spaces, Stephen Luke's would say in his three faces of power, right, are powerful spaces. But the narrative, the worldview, the sort of public belief, public narrative, that's where the power is. If you can control that, you control the other two things. And I think sometimes what happens is we get stuck because of so many of our communities have their back against the wall because of the way institutional and systemic racism play out, the way that historical trauma and oppression play out, where we are forced to play at that first face, which is about influencing decisions, right? Voting, getting things to pass, yes or no, up or down. And that's a good place to be. But we have to continue to think about how do we keep moving further up and get into the narrative space and control the story, right? Control what is understood as right or powerful or the next wise action. So that's to me why I feel like narrative is so central, is because it is the most powerful place to play.
I just want to say thank you to Mitra and Neeraj for speaking first. I'm a little shy, so I don't like speaking first. But so I think I would just jump in and say like where my thoughts are at when it comes to narrative. And like, I think a lot about dominant narrative versus personal narrative. I believe that they can be aligned, but like for a lot of the individuals that I engage with, it is a versus situation, because like dominant narrative as it exists in the United States is one of capitalism and white supremacy, and one that is to serve capitalism and white supremacy and that tells us that our individual narrative has to be one of individualism. When I engage with folks on a regular basis who are community oriented, I consider myself to be a very community-based person. And so, and there is the challenge of like navigating your own personal ideologies, your own personal beliefs in a world that is counter to that. And so I think about like when it talks about who it serves, like it's serving like similar to what Mitra said, like this speaking on like self-hatred, right? Like it serves for us to hate ourselves, because then I'm thinking of like with Black people, like if we don't like the way we look, if we don't like our Black features, like there are capitalist fixes to those things. that will change that and like change in quotes that. I think of also in that process, like what does it take to combat those narratives? Like I think it takes a lot of like internal processing, which I can get into later, like that sort of like step process of that in my head. But yeah, I just think to like boil down like my answer to the question is like, who does it serve? Like it serves people who benefit from white supremacist ideologies, mainly folks in positions of power, folks who are white, and folks who have money are the people who get served. And the people who are at a disadvantage are the people who don't fit in those categories, which is the vast majority of people who live in the United States and throughout the world. And that doesn't mean that we don't have the power to shift that narrative. It just means that we have an uphill battle facing that.
Yeah. Thanks, Chavah, and to all of you for that. And with that in mind, that idea that these narratives are serving the idea of white supremacy and the system of capitalism and some of those other ideas that you guys put forward, I want to jump into a couple of specifics here. First, to Neeraj. So in the aftermath of the 2020 election, and in the aftermath of the attack on the Capitol building in DC, a narrative emerged. I'd say maybe it was resurfaced. That came up was a call for unity, and it's a call that is heard often in times of crisis and even in times of deep injustice. A call from whether it's the media or again from each other that it's time to come together and heal. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, Neeraj. I know you wrote for Pollen about this topic. I want to hear you dig into that a little bit.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that narrative, and who does that serve, and then what could take its place if it's not serving people?
Yeah. So I'll kind of maybe lay this out a little bit overly linear, even though it's not that way. But so for me, I'm constantly aware that we live in cities and countries right now that are increasingly diverse, and research shows that we continue to hunker down into communities of sameness. So we sort ourselves by geography, politics, religion, race, culture. Do you wear a mask or not? Get vaxxed or not, etc. So that's kind of like one reality. Two for me is that, I definitely believe that diverse groups of people working together are more powerful and more effective in the long term. So I think there's some effort to bridge those divides. So that's kind of my grounding. But I don't want to get stuck into the false binary. And I think this is what happens in sort of the mainstream discussion, right? So I would argue, and I think what I wrote about, right, we need the strength, the power, the safety that comes from our people, our tribe, those who we feel most connected to, right, who have our backs. Like that self-segregation into communities of sameness is powerful. And that's what I talked about, like in the way my parents as Indian immigrants found that where we were growing up in a predominantly white suburb. So we need that, right? And to solve our toughest challenges, I probably do believe that we need to bridge and link across with those that maybe who are not like us. But then again, so this is where my critique is that too often that call for unity is feels like a minimization of the power, strength, and necessity of when communities of color especially come together. And that the call for unity, as I was feeling it in January and February, was really a call for status quo, right? It was a call for almost like calm down, a call for like stay in your box, a call for don't get angry. Justice will come, but like it'll come later. And I don't think that is in service of justice or transformation. It felt in service of peace and quiet, which is not where I think we need to be. So to your question about like what should it take, then I guess for me it is as simple, if that's possible, that we call for justice first, and that we put forward a serious pursuit of that, not some artificial engineering of togetherness in the name of national unity. And so then the narrative for me is that unity is a byproduct of justice, and we should articulate that more clearly.
And Neeraj, would you say that sort of as Chavah laid it out, that call for unity is an intentional one that is designed to promote and uplift the status quo that has inherent injustices?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, she said it well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Chavah or Mitra, do you have any thoughts to share there? I've got plenty of other questions I can jump into too.
Yeah, I'd just love to share. I read the essay just to sort of like get grounded again. And thank you so much, Neeraj, and your comments. I think to me, the simplicity of the title, like no justice, no unity, really sums it up. And what it looks like is like, if you're not good, I'm not good. And that's actually like the opposite of, like, to connect it back to dominant narratives, and like the story that's winning right now is like, I'm going to actually get good, and I'm going to step on these other people to make sure I'm good. And that's actually like acceptable and sustainable. And that is like a lot of how, I mean, the book I was talking about, Minor Feelings, like reflects on that, and how a lot of like Asian Americans have participated in that to like actually entrench themselves like in white supremacy and capitalism. And to, like, she unpacks the LA riots, and she unpacks the complexities between like Korean store owners and like Black people and customers and neighbors and like activists and everyone, and like Rodney King and like all these things, and what was really going on, and like how are the relationships between communities, like they can be both fractured and knit together all at the same time, and like what was that like. And so, I think that the topic of no justice, no unity is really about saying like, I'm not good until you're good, and like this country has done right by you. And it can feel easy to choose the short game just for self-interest, because the damage wrought by these systems to our communities is so deep and so vast that it's like, well, that's going to be forever from now. And I think that like our challenge moving forward together is to choose actually like the title, right? Like, if there isn't justice, we're not actually going to be together. And so that's what I'm taking away from it. I'm sorry if that's misrepresenting what the essay was projecting, but it just, that's the phrase that floated to my mind.
That's really great. The idea of I'm not good until you're good raises me a question that I want to pose to Chavah around the idea of unity. In my view, I think the idea of unity is attractive to folks who are otherwise empathetic, because it speaks to a focus on togetherness and collectivism. So there is sort of like a little bit of a spin or maybe deception there to the call for unity. So that call, on a surface level at least, it sort of runs counter to another popular narrative in America, which is that of the rugged individual, which is, I think, in my view, some of the founding idea of American culture, which is, and all the sort of pitfalls that might lead to. And it's definitely not the idea of if I'm good, you're good, or I'm not good until you're good. So Chavah, I want to talk to you, have you hear you talk a little bit about this idea of the rugged individual, who that narrative serves, and what harm that it causes.
Yeah, definitely. So I think like a little background on me, like I grew up in the Twin Cities my whole life. I didn't have the most stable family life, but I had a really strong community in the Twin Cities. Still have a really strong community external of my family, my biological family. Like I have spiritual family. And I think that community is really what like saved me in the end, because like I think about all of the narratives that I was told about individualism, right? Like we were told that we have to, so to speak, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and, you know, like fight our way through, like get all of the grades on our own so that we can go to a good college and then get a good job and then find somebody to marry. Hopefully it's a cis heterosexual relationship, because that's the United States. And then like have a nuclear family, and like that is your unit, that's your community, that's where you are. And I think that's like a concept that I've always struggled with, because like I have people, and like I want to be able to bring my people with me everywhere I go. And so like, I think of individuality and individualism, and it very much does serve, again, like this conversation around like white supremacy and capitalism, because white supremacy wants us to not see ourselves in each other. Capitalism wants us to not see ourselves in each other. It in this way that if we do see ourselves in each other, we see like, oh, my pain is your pain and your pain is my pain. And like, we have a responsibility to each other to come together to find justice for one another, very similar to what Neeraj, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, Neeraj?
Yep, you got it.
Okay. Is saying around unity and justice. Like, we can't have community in, especially like in a place like the Twin Cities, where we have so many people from so many different cultures coming together to live in the same space. We need to be able to break down those barriers of individualism in order to step into one another, and in order to like really look at what it takes to build for each other. Like, I think of just this past summer, or last summer, right? Like, we experienced this very traumatic experience as a collective in the Twin Cities when George Floyd was murdered by a police officer. And then the response was one of anger, one of rage, and like one that I personally feel like was a justified response, which was the rioting and the protests that happened. Although I consider rioting to be a valid form of protest, in my opinion, but that's a whole totally different conversation. But that, what came out of that was what I saw, mutual aid networks started popping up. The St. Paul Community Collective, I think is what they're called, or the St. Paul Community Hub, I think is what they're called, started, I don't know how deep their work was, but they blew up after the riots. And now we have like a very like strong structure to protect people who are homeless in the Twin Cities, who are often forgotten. We have a number, I know some people who started a mutual aid fund for trans disabled people who need funds for their medical supplies. I know people who started, like, I know so many people who started doing so many different works just to make sure that we got each other. And I think that that is a threat to individualism. I think that is a threat to capitalism and white supremacy in and of itself, just because people saw each other in a way where they were like, we are one. We still get to be ourselves as people, but we, in this collective space, get to be in this space together in that way. I don't know, that was kind of a rant, but I hope it made sense.
Great rant, great rant. I have a follow-up question that I want to pose to Mitra that comes on the back of that. But before I do that, I want to see if Neeraj or Mitra, you have any thoughts or comments based on what Chavah just shared.
The only thing I was going to add that popped into my head was that assimilation is a form of exclusion. And I think mainstream society tries to tell you that assimilation is a form of belonging. And I don't have anything more to say about that, but that's what popped into my head. It's a trick that asks you to give up often way more, especially for communities of color, way more. So I think that when you hear that call, watch out. So anyway, that's my very wise thoughts.
I want to end everything I say with "that's my very wise thoughts." It's like, I'm just soaking up what Chavah said on, well, what both of you just said, because it was like heavy after heavy. And things sitting with me are that we are we are socialized not to see ourselves in each other, when actually we have more in common with each other than like the every men that we are like told to aspire to. And that doesn't mean we flatten our causes and say like our oppression is all the same, but it means that we have so much in common and that we learn from that together. And that the false alternative to like learning from each other and finding each other is like fitting into the thing that is said to be like what you want. And that actually that is a self-destructive trajectory. And that's the point. Like coming back to the beginning, it's like, well, if you just destroy yourself, you'll be fine. It's almost like that's the goal. So I don't know. I'm sitting with that. It's really sitting with me. That's all.
Well, let's jump toward that a little bit closer. Mitra, in the essay that you wrote for Pollen, you took on an aspect of this idea of individualism that's actually broadly popular with, I'm sure, many of the folks on this call. I know Pollen has written about it in the past and talked a lot about it, but it's the idea of self-care. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the self-care narrative, how it differs or doesn't differ from the idea of individualism, and how you see the balance between self-care and what Chavah was talking about, which is a more community-focused, collective care?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate Pollen giving me the chance to write about that. And I think for me, it was an attempt to kind of process what we are all coming out of. The pandemic isn't over. We are still in it. But there is also this slow emergence. And so in it, I write about what my year was in 2020 and the different overlapping crises of exploitative capitalism and exploitative racism, and just how you can't like medicate yourself effectively against most of those things or all of them without like structural change. And the entire like the idea that like self-care in popular culture can often be viewed as sort of like self-soothing or just like it's about helping you feel good in the moment, but like you're not actually good and your life isn't good. And like the experience I had supporting like friends, families, loved ones, constituents, community through job loss, home loss, worked and was very like coordinated with and sort of like working alongside what the group that Chavah mentioned of St. Paul Camps Hub, and like trying to push the city's response to folks experiencing like homelessness and being unhoused. Like I talk about all of that because it's just like we can't self-care our way out of these systemic failures. We have to embrace a politics that is about radical permanent community care. And it's not just like check out from your computer and like take some time to yourself and just like put on this lotion. Like it's like I can't get health care because our country like denies it to people. Like I can't get therapy. I don't have a job, and like my health care is connected to my job. Therefore, I can't get like mental health support. And I can't take time for myself. I take care of my children and my grandparents and my like sick friends and on and on and on. And so we have to not like, the essay isn't meant to condemn like self-soothing behaviors. It's more that like the sort of culture that promises us that that is how you deal with it is like wrong and profiting off of that idea too. And what we actually need is like structural change that guarantees care for people. And so the pandemic exposed that. And as we talk about like what's next and what do we do now, the thing I've been trying to slowly process is there's kind of two things. And one of them is like, what are the structural changes we need? And a lot of that is stuff a lot of us on this call already fight for. Like, here's all the sort of like policies that would guarantee like our wealth, our well-being, our rootedness, our care, and everything. I do also think in the maybe there's like a next essay coming or a next internal conversation that I'll share once I get through it. But it's about that structural change. But there also is like an inner orientation to this work that we have to figure out, that's like, how do I think about myself? And like, how do I, some people call it like decolonizing how you think, right? To like show up in that work. And then also just like our everyday lives, right? Like just our everyday lives, waiting for the bus or like taking a call from a friend or whatever you're doing in your human life. So that's where I'm trying to get to. That's what I'm kind of like processing and digesting right now. But there is a reality that we have to confront that does require like an organized politics. And it happens in many arenas. It happens in arenas like what Chavah was talking about. It happens in arenas like the one that I'm in and the one that Neeraj is in. And it's all coordinated, it all has to work. So
yeah. You mentioned organized politics there, which takes me to a question I want to ask. We've started to pull apart the narrative of rugged individualism and elevating a narrative of collective care. And as you said, Mitra, a lot of those changes, cultural changes, but some of them require political heavy lifting. And, a common path people take when they want to make change, whether it's a narrative change or community change or systemic change, is to wade into politics and, work to get someone elected who represents their identities or their values or both, or put themselves in a position to become an elected official. And, it's an election year in Minneapolis here, so we're going to be hearing about, these particular levers of power a lot between now and November. But a lot of the time, people come away from those kind of political efforts feeling that a change in elected leadership didn't do enough, which leads to another narrative, which says that political work doesn't matter and political efforts aren't the real lever of change that we think they might be. So I want to just ask all three of you, how important do you see as political power in affecting change and affecting narrative change? And then how can people who are in that work, whether they are, the elected officials themselves, whether they are just volunteering or knocking doors, whether they're working on a campaign, whatever the case may be, how can people in that work stave off that narrative of cynicism that says that doesn't matter?
If it's okay, I'd love to hear what other people think of this first, because I think I'm in my head on this all the time. I'm not going to punk out and not answer, but I'm actually like dying to know what others want to say.
Yeah.
I would love to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go for it.
I'll follow you.
So I think about this a lot because like as an organizer who works for a nonprofit that like does a lot of political work, it's really hard not to get like bogged down by that feeling of like, oh, like how far is this going to go? Like, is this really like, is getting this person elected really going to make change? But like at the end of the day, what it is like when we elect an individual, we have to remember that we are electing one person, and one person cannot do the work to change the entire world. It takes all of us together to do that work. I think there is a lot of conversation around I think like part of why I enjoy doing the work that I do at my current employer is because like after the election season is over, we don't go away. I think there's a lot of like work in elections where like people burn out really quickly because they're putting in like 60 to 80-hour weeks working on campaigns. And then once the campaign is over, once they win or lose or whatever, they're like, okay, we can wash our hands of this, go take a nap, and like we'll come back next year, right? And like the people in the community don't have the opportunity to come back next year. Like they have to live in community with whoever was elected. And so like there is a certain level, and in order to make change, we have to be in community with whoever was elected. We can't just like vote them into office and like be like, okay, they're going to do their job now. Like, no, we have to like be having meetings with them. We have to call them, send them emails, like make sure that we are developing a rapport and like developing some sort of relationship with our elected officials in order to like remind them that like we are real humans, but also to remind themselves that like they are humans, right? Like I've heard a lot of people who sit in office name what Mitra was speaking on earlier about like the loss of identity once you get into office and like have sat in office for a while, and like loss of individualism. I will say, I don't think she specifically said loss of identity. I think it was loss of individualism, but like that is very much a real thing. And I think that one of the biggest things is like there's a process to organizing, right? Like you have the event, and then there's the absorption process, there's the action, and then more people come in, and then you absorb more. And like in order to really like follow those steps, like you have to make sure that you're doing that absorption part of bringing people in and sitting them down and being like, okay, what do you want to do with this power that we have now? I think I will say like very clearly, like, no, I do not think politics are the end all be all. No, I don't think politics are going to save me, especially me and my Black people. But I do think that they are a route to change, and they're a route to maintenance. And I think that maintenance of the political system to make sure that we are changing the incremental things that we can change in the structure before we come through and like tear it all down and start something new is gonna have to happen to protect as many like literal lives as possible in that time. Yeah.
This is the type of question that makes me want to like jump into my computer screen and like be with all of you in this question. And I have way too many thoughts, but I also just want to acknowledge that some of what I think I want to say, well, I have very few original thoughts. So I'm just going to quote where some of these thoughts are going to come from. Scholar and activist Hari Hahn, if you haven't read any of her work. And then recent conversations I've had with friends and super smart folks like Ashley Fairbanks, D.A. Bullock, and my council member in the 5th Ward in North Minneapolis, Jeremiah Allison. So this is like a mashup of all of that wisdom, but like, or trash, you can take it how you want. But one is, I don't think we should blame people for any kind of cynicism or, you know, mistrust or anything that they have, right? Because most of what people actually experience in politics is real and true, right? The disappointment, the lack of change, the policy drift, especially for communities of color. So it's real. Then I'd also say that like engaging in public life, this is something that like Hari Hahn writes a lot about. It's a skill that needs to be cultivated. You're not actually just born with that skill. And then add to that a system that is constantly set up or trying to make people disengaged. It's purposely created to create disengagement from and pushing people out of exercising their power or building power. So those two thoughts, and then also that like, how do we build power and agency for folks in their everyday lives so that it can translate into some like the public life or into politics, which is why I think like voting or just voter turnout is like a short-sighted strategy, right? So, and Chavah, this is kind of what you're saying, like how do we actually work on supporting, shifting, building power for people, period, full stop, be that for their work in politics or at the grocery store or at their job or wherever. And how do we create institutions that support that? And how do we make the investments that are required for people to take, you know, like build the capacity, the motivation and the skills to get out there, A, yes, to vote, and then B, to do all the other things that's required to keep people accountable. Like the last thing I'll say is like people need places where they can learn, where they learn how to see how powerful they really are, right? And I think that if we just like voting is one way for sure, but there's so many other ways, and we need to be working on the both and of that.
I feel like a kitchen sink of I'm like, when it's finally time to speak on the thing that I'm constantly thinking about, I have like nothing but incoherence. I think that this question is like emotional for a lot of people because it speaks to like a core motivation a lot of people have. Like a core motivation a lot of people have is to fight to make the world a better place. And so when a theory of change that you have like really bought into feels like it wasn't enough or like it's not true, then it can create like an existential dread for people. And it can leave you feeling listless and kind of like drifting. I saw that feeling a lot in 2020. I felt that feeling a lot in 2020. I saw people stand up for like a really bold politics that would get called radical, but is actually like an appropriate response to the extremity of the status quo, right? Like it is, sometimes I have a hard time when people characterize like what I believe in as quote unquote radical, because to me, it's like not fringe. And what is actually ruling our lives is like a very literal fringe constituency benefits from it. And the rest of us are suffering. And so to say that like a response to that, or like to demand an entirely different paradigm, is flipping over a whole table. It both like is true. And it's also like most people would benefit from the type of policies I advocate for and that many of us here advocate for. And so to like marginalize and put me and like what we're fighting for outside the mainstream also feels like a misdirect. It feels like an intentional, it's like lying about us. It's like, don't lie about me. Don't lie about our work and our lives. So I ran for office in 2018, and I've been serving our community since September 2018. And I'm still getting invited to events and talking to folks. And like one of the top questions I'm still getting asked is like, why did you run for office? And what is it like being an elected official? And I both understand and appreciate and respect where that question comes from. I think that it is like only good intentions, but I also do struggle with it sometimes because it feels like I have come out of a burning house long enough to like talk to someone and they're like, what's it like being here? Like at the burning house? Like, it's like, I am literally burning up with like what it's like and how it is and whatever. And everything I ran is like only reaffirmed by what I'm fighting for. But a lot of the questions I'm still getting asked are about like representation. Like, what's it like to be an Asian woman elected official? What's it like to be a woman of color? What's it like to be a progressive woman of color? Like, how do you navigate like the gaps between your values and the bureaucracy and system you're fighting in? And these are perennial questions. They are constantly happening. I do think about them every hour, but it's also like, I worry sometimes that we have been tricked by like representation only politics, and that we have been, because we get so little as communities, we're told that like just being there is good enough and we should be happy. And so this identity only politics sometimes really often fails us because, you know, like we're not changing structures, and the symbol of the people can't just be what rises up. It has to be the actual like material well-being of the people that is brought along and is like centered in the work of electeds who like come from movement spaces, or who like at bare minimum say that they do. And so I understand people like seeing all these things colossally fail, and that it's like, I'm done. And I get that. And it's like, I try to be a person who doesn't make organizers like quit. I feel like I try, like every day I wake up and I'm just like, how can I be someone who makes like organizers' jobs easier? And that doesn't mean I meet that aspiration all the time, but it's like a constant thought I have, because it's not just about being like, okay, I'm here now, tell me what to do, and just being like sitting there. But you have to become an animated force. Like you have to become someone who is like in rooms no one else is being invited to, and just like not being in that room and being happy and being like, I'm so glad to be here as like the first and only Asian American woman. But to be like, what the hell is wrong with all of you that like you all went a cool like several hundred years and now I'm here and we're supposed to be glad, and just kind of be like the hysterical brown woman in the room. And it's like hurtful to be that. And so something I ask for with folks that I work with is like, I don't want you to carry my hurt. You're carrying a lot, but at least like see it, and like see that like there's a new place that I'm in now where I'm getting ripped up too. And it's not the same as like how people are getting ripped up by like capitalism, but it's like this thing where I'm not myself when I go into these systems. So that complexity is something that I'm unpacking a lot. And it makes me think about like the concept I'm kind of digging into is just like co-governance. And that's a very, I don't know, it's not like the best word, but it's just sort of like a word, but it's It's about like, how do we hold our relationships, to the point that Chavah was saying, right? Like, how do we hold our relationships after the election? Because the truth is, like, and this is a thing that doesn't feel good to say out loud, because it just makes me feel bad. It just makes me feel like people don't deserve to hear this. But it's like, elected officials also still need help to do the right thing. Like, because it's not about our individual morals. It's about like how we are asked to be in a big, multifaceted, moving system of power. It's about power. And like, we are constantly asked to like pit things that don't deserve to be pitted against each other. And so I wish that like electeds would come to that conversation and be like, here's what I need to do the right thing. And then that like movement organizers could say, that's like either not acceptable or not fair, or like, we're going to help you in this other way or something. But like, we don't feel like we can say that. It's just kind of like, well, we got you in there and now you go and like be by yourself. And that's actually also like a savior politics. That's also a kind of rugged individualism. Like, that's not right either for our leaders who are like serving the movement in this role, the elected role. So I'm really struggling through these things as someone who like is fighting through bureaucracy, y'all.
Yeah.
It's like bureaucracy that is organized around law, that is organized around white supremacy. And we need vulnerability in our like movement relationships across elected office, and this whole system doesn't like support that either. So what we are getting, the fruit of that, is failure, bitterness, hurt feelings, lost relationships, hopelessness, quitting. And you know, I don't want to say like, if you quit, like you're bad. Like, it's a privilege to a degree to be able to even participate in a lot of these, like in elections and campaigns and policy, etc. But and the fruits of what is happening right now are like, I think, poisoning our hearts in a unique way. And to Chavah's point, it's not the end all be all and not the savior, but it is an arena in which our battle must be won also. Necessary, not sufficient. So I welcome people's thoughts on this, but it's something I'm really grappling with. And I want to break through it because I believe that a lot of our future depends on it. Not all of it, but a lot of it.
Thank you,
Can I
Mitra.
jump in,
And
Jerome?
also
Or are
thank
we?
you. Yeah, go ahead, Neeraj. We have just a couple minutes left, but yeah, jump in.
I'll just do a quick thing, which is, I mean, I think that the language that Mitra, you named and were alluding to too, around power, like the power to govern is like, again, that's a really powerful form of power. So there's that. But then the power to influence those that govern, right, is also super powerful. And sometimes what I wonder is, and this is what I was saying earlier too, which is, where are we in community creating space for people to learn what it takes to use their power to influence, to hold accountable those who also have power in their governing role, right? And then in that continuum, you know, I think of this framework that I've read about that talks about leadership, like build, influence, govern. And so we have to be building leaders who have power. We have to be creating ways for those leaders to influence, right, and to hold accountable. And then there's the governing. And I think too often we put a Mitra in office and we say we have governing power, and then like somehow that's it. But there's like all this outside game that we have to invest in and spend time doing. And I think we under-resource that. We underestimate the essential nature of that, especially at a time where that kind of civil infrastructure is weak. Maybe for sure at a national level, but of course also locally as well. There's very little of that, it feels like.
Yeah. Thanks, Neeraj. We are just about at the end of our discussion time here, but I've got one last question that I'd like to pose to each of you, and then we will do some breakout groups. So for those of us who are engaged in change work beyond the political sphere, whether we're in the nonprofit or the public sector or volunteering or organizing or other kinds of support, what are some of the ways, or what would you say for each of you is like the one thing you would say about how we can be more effective agents of a narrative change in our everyday work and decision making? Because I know a lot of the folks on this call are working on change, and sometimes it is direct narrative change, sometimes it's indirect narrative change, but we're all kind of in that sphere. So how can we be more effective agents of that kind of change in the way we do our work? Neeraj, I'll point to you to start.
One thing, I'm going to say two things fast. And I'm just going to steal this from something I've been trying to build into my own work from the race class narrative research. One is talk about racial justice and economic justice together in the narrative work. And then just from like the article that I wrote for y'all that I've been thinking a lot about is how do you talk about justice and unity together? So stop talking in the binaries, racial justice, economic justice, justice and unity at the same time.
Thanks, Neeraj. Mitra?
Can you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, what is a way that we can be more effective agents of narrative change in our everyday work, in the way we make decisions, no matter what sector we might be in or in the way we might be attacking that change?
What my mind is bringing to me is like, say no to respectability politics. Like there's a lot of pressure in all the places that we're in to kind of like make people be okay with what we have to say, and to sort of go through like there's like the preamble and there's what you really have to say, and we all have a little preamble in our heads, or many of us have a preamble that's just like the invisible sort of like, this is so that I can kind of like emotionally fluff some pillows for you to like lay on the couch of my truth. And really it's like there's like this cold shattering of what the last year has been, of just like people don't have homes, folks are dying, like people are getting murdered, like elders are getting attacked. I could just keep going on, right? Like,
Yeah.
And so it feels like a function of white supremacy to like be like, well, I'm glad that you invited me to the brunch because I'd like to offer some thoughts for your consideration that people are getting murdered and don't have homes and like don't, it's just like, I understand that we have to sort of like meet people where they're at and help people like access a conversation. That is a part of our work. That absolutely is. But lots of times like people are readier than we are letting ourselves believe. And people can also move if we are willing to push. And like, we have to be able to just take more risks. And I don't know, like, I think that the last year and a half has like ground me down to a point where I can no longer be like a respectable person of color in the meeting with the lawyers who's just like, oh, you raised such an interesting point. Like I have had to like cuss some people out. I have had to like cry in front of like folks who don't feel what I feel. Like I have had to lose my damn mind because people like aren't. And so it's weird because like those things have been disruptive and like no one else has seen those things and it's just kind of happening in a channel. But then like things are moving in a different way overall because I am just like because I am just like not sitting there and being like nice with my notebook. And so that's exhausting. But I'm not saying you have to become like so much everywhere you go, and it's like you go to the coffee shop and they're like, what would you like today? And you're like, I would like justice, and flip over the whole cat. Like that's not what I'm saying. But like, I guess like a lot of us are in these places where we're just sort of like asked to maintain a social order, like every hour, every meeting, every day. And like, I have just lost my ability to do that. And I have actually been surprised by some of the results, even as it's also been like upsetting. So I don't know. Call me after you do it and let me know how it went. But like, we have to break silences. Like how are we going to get there if we can't even say anything about it? Right. So that's my encouragement to y'all.
Thanks. We'll give Mitra's personal phone number at the end of this so you can just give her a call. Totally fine. Chavah, bring us home. What is your advice for folks who want to do this work a little better?
Yeah, I think, so my advice is coming derivative of advice that I was given by a mentor when I was very young. So I have to credit Tish Jones, the executive director of To Where It Speaks, for these thoughts that are about to come. But I remember a conversation in which she told me that if you want to create change in your community, you have to start with yourself. And then you go to your family, and then you go to your friends, and you go to your greater community outside of that, and then the state, and then the world, and then et cetera, right? It's like very much like a raindrop into a big lake, right? Like it starts with a ripple effect. And so like what I would say, like the biggest part of that I would say is like start with yourself. And that means like combating like the negative self-talk that you have, combating the just like whatever narratives that you have, and like really challenge those narratives and see like what of these narratives are rooted in white supremacy, what of these narratives are rooted in capitalism. Maybe it's something like, oh, I can't I can't let somebody else help me with this because like then I'm a failure, right? And like that's not true. Like you can let somebody else help you with that. Whatever it is, maybe it's like having somebody else help you tie your shoe, maybe it's having somebody else help you like build an entire network of support for your community. Like, you know, like it doesn't matter what it is, you don't have to do it alone. And then I think with that, when entering into those conversations, because like it's not about like, I think like it can be a little touchy to enter a conversation with individuals with the mindset of I'm gonna change you, right? I'm gonna change the way you think. Like that's like not really what I'm trying to say. But like I think what I'm trying to say is like when you sit down with somebody, if you hold a close relationship with someone, if you've done that internal work to challenge your own narratives and rewrite your own narratives in your head about who you are, how you maneuver in the world, and how you want to engage with your community, it's going to be a lot easier to like point out to your people when their narratives maybe don't align with their values. And have those conversations with them about how can we align our narratives with our values, and then taking that and shifting it into the larger, the external, the further. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for your words this morning. It's really been enlightening. I'm going to take a lot out of this idea of pushing away from rugged individualism and turning more towards collectivism, and all of the different tentacles of these narratives that reach into all the different parts of our lives. So I'm trying to be more aware of those and push against them whenever I can. But thank you to all of you. I think we're going to breakout groups next, and so I'll hand it back over.
Thank you, Jerome. Appreciate that panel conversation. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your thoughts and wisdom with us. If we could get a virtual applause for Mitra and Neeraj and Chavah, thank you so much, and to Jerome for his always awesome moderation skills. We are gonna move into our small group discussions. Birthday boy Tom is gonna put everybody into breakout rooms. We have just about 20 minutes before we wrap up with some closing comments. I wanna say thank you to all of the Pollenites who volunteered to host our breakout conversations. They'll be in the rooms and will help facilitate conversation and introductions. Just a couple of group agreements that are up on the screen. Take space, make space. In other words, if you're usually quiet in group discussions, you know, challenge yourself to take up more space and engage in the conversation. And if you're usually verbose, be mindful of others who may have something that they would like to say. Share the lesson, not the story. Just remember that this is a safe space. What people are sharing with one another is oftentimes confidential. So, you know, don't share names or organizations unless you've been given explicit permission to do so. And be game. These conversations work best when we're all open and vulnerable and respecting everybody's experiences. So please keep that in mind. We do have a few discussion prompts to help guide the conversation. There's a bunch of them here and your hosts have all of these and can kind of help guide which ones your group would like to engage in for the time that we have left. But talking about, you know, what new narratives you're seeing in your own communities and what kind of catalysts for that change that you've seen. I love these questions about, you know, what kind of a future do you imagine for Minneapolis and St. Paul? What kind of stories do you want to see shared about that future? What we need to do as individuals and a community to make that future happen. And even the question that Jerome posed to Neeraj and Chavah and Mitra, about how we can be better agents of narrative change in our own work. And by all means, if you want to go in a totally different direction, that's fine too. So the time is yours. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom to get us into breakouts, and then we'll come back just for a couple of minutes of closing remarks. Thanks, everybody. All right, it looks like everybody is slowly making their way back from their breakouts. I hope everybody had a good discussion for their groups. I know we never have enough time for these conversations, but keeping folks on Zoom longer than an hour and a half also feels a little bit painful. But maybe later this fall, we'll have a chance to gather in person again. So just in our last couple of minutes here, I just wanted to again say thank you to Mitra and Neeraj and Chavah and to Jerome for this morning's conversation. Huge thank you again to our sponsors, the Bush Foundation, US Bank, Software for Good, Ide Bailey, Clockwork, and Hiring Revolution, the new book coming out from Team Dynamics. We do have an event survey that's coming out, but good news, it's totally new and very pretty and much more interactive than ones we've done before. So please take a couple minutes to complete it, and we'll be sending out a follow-up email next week with resources and links to articles and books that were shared in today's conversation, and to keep you connected with everybody that you met here today. So thank you everyone for being with us this morning. Hope everybody has a great rest of their week. Take care.